For what purposes does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 894, strongly condemning and denouncing the drastic rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 894, resolution strongly condemning and denouncing the drastic rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on House Resolution 894.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas against Israel, anti-Semitism has surged in the United States and around the world. Reports show that there's a nearly 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the weeks after the attack. These incidents include harassment, vandalism, and assault. Americans have been punched, beaten, and forced to flee for their lives from swerving cars simply because they are Jewish. A Jewish cemetery in Brooklyn, Ohio, was vandalized with swastikas. On college campuses, Jewish students have been subjected to harassment, threats, and forced to hide from violent protests. In a recent survey, 73% of Jewish college students said they had experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism this academic year. In the same survey, just 39% of Jewish students said they felt comfortable with their peers knowing they were Jewish. Less than half of Jewish students surveyed said that they felt safe on campus. At a hearing before our committee last month, a college student testified that she now thinks twice before wearing any sign of her Jewish faith. This was a young woman who's maybe 20 years old. She had the courage to come and testify before Congress, but she can't safely wear something that would suggest to her fellow students and her teachers that she is Jewish. She testified that her family and friends who live in Israel, people who are under nearly constant rocket attack from Hamas and others, check in with her every day to see if she is safe. They are in a war zone. She is in the United States, and they are checking to make sure that she is safe. These incidents are absolutely horrifying, Mr. Speaker. They are unacceptable in the United States, in any civilized society. Members of the Jewish community should not have to hide their faith in order to safely go about their lives or receive an education. I urge all members to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
From New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of any and all serious and meaningful efforts to combat anti-Semitism. The explosion of anti-Semitism around the world, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
The explosion of anti-Semitism around the world on college campuses and online is so shocking that it was the subject of nearly every Jewish household's Thanksgiving meal a week ago. The Jewish community is absolutely right to consider this terrifying situation a five-alarm fire, as Senator Schumer so appropriately put it in his moving speech to the nation just a few days ago. Unfortunately, this resolution does absolutely nothing to genuinely counter the scourge of anti-Semitism, nor does it help bring us together with the unity of purpose that this topic merits. Rather, it is another attempt in a long series of veiled efforts by the GOP to weaponize Jewish lives for political gains. It is another partisan gotcha game that amounts to cheap value signaling, not serious action. But if there ever was a time for real action, it is now. Today, in the face of the largest increase in anti-Semitism, both violent and virulent, in this nation's history, we have a clear choice. We can abuse this moment to try to inflict inter-party political damage, or we can rise to the occasion and do something real and powerful to actually help the Jewish community. Just in the last few weeks, we have seen disgusting displays of outright anti-Semitism. Over the weekend, protesters in Philadelphia targeted a Jewish business. It is plainly and unequivocally anti-Semitic to hold Jews collectively responsible for Israel's actions. In my district, vile anti-Semitic graffiti has been scrawled on apartment buildings on the Upper East Side. And on the Upper West Side, 2 Jewish women were assaulted after calling out individuals who were despicably tearing down posters of Israeli hostages. Last week in Brooklyn, 3 attackers violently attacked a 15-year-old Jewish boy, yelling "Free Palestine" as they punched and kicked the stranger. This anti-Semitic hate is happening across the country. The Oakland City Council rejected a bid to denounce Hamas, as speaker after speaker espoused dangerously misguided and factually erroneous views at a deeply troubling anti-Semitic public hearing. Since the Israel-Hamas war began, the GOP has seemed gleeful at their partisan wedging at the expense of the Jewish community, and they have utterly failed to do anything serious to address this crisis. If they object to my charges, let me clearly ask them here today 3 key questions. First, what have my friends on the other side of the aisle, the only ones who actually control the agenda on the floor, done to implement the White House's national strategy to counter anti-Semitism? This historic whole-of-government plan, which has bipartisan support, has been completely ignored in this dysfunctional MAGA extremist Congress. The answer is clear. They have done nothing. Second, when will the GOP majority stop its efforts to defund the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the office that must protect Jewish students from the horrendous discrimination they face on campus today? In order to enforce Title VI, the law that prevents such discrimination in education, the department needs the resources to put legal and investigatory boots on the ground. The answer: the majority still supports defunding this office, and that means Jewish students will remain at terrible risk. Third, what will the GOP do to ensure that the high-risk nonprofit security grant program run through the Department of Homeland Security has a meaningful increase in funding? This program keeps our synagogues and Hebrew schools safe across the country. The answer: House Republicans have done absolutely nothing to shore up this program. I demand that we take real action. Representatives Goldman, Raskin, and I today introduced a resolution which would commit ourselves to the full implementation of the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. I implore my Republican colleagues to join us and take concrete action. And I call on them to actually protect Jewish lives by a dramatic increase in funding for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and the high-risk nonprofit security grant program. That's what taking meaningful action would look like. Mr. Speaker, by bringing this resolution to the floor without a single Democratic co-sponsor, which is extremely unusual, and by rushing it to a vote without careful and considerate collaboration, my Republican friends have shown us who they are and precisely what are their intentions. In my 3 decades in Congress, I have voted on numerous bills and resolutions addressing anti-Semitism, including my own. I have never seen an anti-Semitism-focused vehicle come to the floor without the co-sponsorship of a single member of the minority party. The Bipartisan Anti-Semitism Task Force doesn't support such partisan gamesmanship, nor does the Anti-Defamation League, nor does the American Jewish Committee. With this resolution, the GOP has shown themselves fundamentally unserious about combating anti-Semitism. Of course, none of us should be surprised. If our friends on the other side of the aisle were serious about combating anti-Semitism, they would have spoken up when former President Trump called the Nazis in Charlottesville very fine people. They would have condemned the former president when he dined with known Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes. Chairman Jordan would have thought better before tweeting out Kanye, Elon, Trump, sending out dog whistles to their white supremacist anti-Semitic base. And they would have chosen their recent witnesses more carefully. Chairman Jordan chose to give a platform to Robert Kennedy Jr. just days after he trafficked in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories suggesting Jews were responsible for COVID. And I cannot help but note that although this resolution strongly condemns and denounces anti-Semitism, its authors carefully avoided mentioning any of the obvious instances of anti-Semitism coming from their own leaders. The resolution is flawed in other ways as well. For example, the resolution implicitly compares some peaceful protesters with the January 6th rioters and insurrectionists. I suppose they have their reasons for that. More problematically, the resolution suggests that all anti-Zionism, it states that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is either intellectually disingenuous or just factually wrong. And it unfairly implicates many of my Orthodox former constituents in Brooklyn, many of whose families rose from the ashes of the Holocaust. While most anti-Semitism is indeed anti-Semitic, the authors, if they were at all familiar with Jewish history and culture, should know about Jewish anti-Zionism that was and is expressly not anti-Semitic. This resolution ignores the fact that even today, certain Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities, the Satmar in New York and others, as well as adherents of the pre-state Jewish labor movement, have held views that are at odds with the modern Zionist conception. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, quote, the anti-Zionist worldview of the ultra-Orthodox groups, like the Satmar Hasidim, perceives Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel as an anti-Messianic act. That is to say that these ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews believe that only the Messiah can bring about the true Israel. And I assure you, the Satmar Hasidic Jews are certainly not anti-Semitic. I should also note that there are those who try to smear even progressive pro-Israel supporters with the inappropriate label of Israel hater or anti-Zionist. Under this resolution, those who love Israel deeply but criticize some of its policy approaches could be considered anti-Zionist. That could make every democratic Jewish member of this body, because they all criticize the recent Israeli judicial reform package, de facto anti-Semites. Might that be the author's intention? Again, let me be unequivocally clear. Most anti-Zionism, particularly in this moment, has a real anti-Semitism problem. But we cannot fairly say that one equals the other. As the most senior Jewish member in this House, with perhaps the largest Jewish constituency in this country, I have always and will always support real, meaningful legislation to combat anti-Semitism. This, of course, is deeply personal for me and for so many of my constituents. Indeed, I take a backseat to no one in this body when it comes to fighting against this scourge. In the aftermath of October 7th, we have a moral obligation to act to protect our own Jewish citizens and our critical ally, Israel. I pray that the GOP majority makes today the day that they stop playing these partisan games and commit themselves to doing the real work to protect Jewish lives. There is not a single minute to spare. I reserve the balance of my time.
From New York reserves, the gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an exchange of letters between the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Judiciary Committee concerning House Resolution 894.
Without objection.
I will say just briefly that I very much do applaud the gentleman from New York, who I think has shown tremendous leadership in many ways in standing up for Israel and fighting against anti-Semitism in this country. I think that one of the valuable things that we've seen over the last several weeks is that we have had bipartisan support on both counts. I actually sponsored a separate resolution dealing specifically with the problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses, and that got overwhelming bipartisan support on this floor. I think it only had about 21 no votes, and so that's been very encouraging. And then with respect to the three charges that were mentioned, number one, there is legislation in the House right now to codify the President's executive order, which I think it's important that we move forward. Number two, far from saying we shouldn't have an Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education, I myself and Representative Burgess Owens wrote a letter to the head of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education telling them they need to be doing more. They need to be more proactive in looking into anti-Semitic incidents at our universities, and we'd certainly welcome your support on that letter. And number three, as far as the protection for synagogues and other facilities, I'd be very interested in partnering with you on any such efforts. I would now like to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for managing the time today. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this resolution that strongly condemns the dramatic rise of anti-Semitism both here in our nation and abroad. Last week, I had the privilege and the honor, frankly, of speaking with Amir Ohana, who is the Speaker of the Knesset. We discussed a lot of things. We talked about how, since Hamas's horrific and brutal terrorist attack against Israelis on October 7th, how life has changed not only in Israel, but around the world. We also talked about how we've seen an explosion, an absolute explosion of anti-Semitic incidents, attacks, and harassment in Israel, here in our own nation, and across the world. Mr. Speaker, two interesting statistics, if I can. According to the Anti-Defamation League, since the Hamas massacre on October the 7th, anti-Semitic incidences around this nation, our nation, have increased over 400% compared to the same time period last year. The second statistic, Mr. Speaker, more Jews have been murdered, were murdered on October 7th than on any other single day since the Holocaust. Let that sink in. We've seen members of this very body repeat blatantly anti-Semitic rhetoric and spread lies about Israel and her right to exist. Let me be absolutely clear. Such hate has no place in the halls of Congress nor in our national discourse. It is our fundamental responsibility as leaders and as members of Congress to condemn and fight these horrific acts of hate and discrimination against the Jewish community. And that's why I'm proud to work with my colleague, Congressman Max Miller, to introduce this critical resolution to condemn and denounce all instances of domestic and global anti-Semitism. A few months ago, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity, really the privilege, to take a group of people through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. A lot of us have been there, not too far away from here in the Capitol where we're standing. That museum serves not only as a reminder of the atrocities that took place during the Holocaust, but it also serves as a stark reminder that we can never forget the horrors of the Holocaust and that we, as leaders, have an obligation and a duty to make sure that it never happens again. For these reasons, I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this very simple yet critical resolution. It's absolutely important that we send a clear and firm message to the world that the United States House of Representatives stands shoulder to shoulder with the Jewish community here in the United States and abroad. Mr. Speaker, as Jews around the world celebrate Hanukkah very soon in the next few days, we should remember the words of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. He said, quote, "Hanukkah tells us not to curse the darkness, but instead to bring light to the world. It tells us to fight back and not be afraid." We should truly heed those words. I thank my colleagues for supporting this resolution. And Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I would like to let the gentleman from New York know that we have no further speakers and I am prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I give myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we hear in this resolution about the opposition to anti-Semitism. As I said before, I would be more impressed with the sincerity of that opposition if the Republican Party were not trying to defund the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the office that enforces Title VI to protect Jewish students on campus. And if the Republicans were not opposing an increase in funding for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and for the high-risk nonprofit security grant program that protects our synagogues and other Jewish institutions. Mr. Speaker, the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and across the world is a real and growing problem. I wish the majority would use its power to actually do something about it instead of playing partisan political games. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 894? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, I
For
request
what
the
purposes
yeas
the
and nays.
gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purposes does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.